Please don't let him kill me. That's what my daughter whispered into a phone at 11:40 at night. And behind her voice, I could hear glass hitting a tile floor. I could hear a man's voice, loud, slurred, furious. I could hear the specific kind of fear that doesn't announce itself with screaming, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from someone who has already learned that screaming makes it worse. 10 minutes later, I was standing in her kitchen with my knee pressed into her husband's shoulder blade while 2 deputies came through the front door with their hands on their weapons. He was face down on the tile, yelling that the old man had attacked him. Nobody was looking at him, though. Both deputies were looking at me. One of them noticed something in the way I had his wrist pinned. Not violent, controlled. He noticed my breathing. He noticed I wasn't sweating, wasn't shaking, wasn't even breathing hard. He asked me one question. "Sir, were you in the service?" I looked at him and said 2 words. "Retired Navy." That was all. I didn't mention the SEAL teams. I didn't mention Afghanistan. I didn't mention the men I'd carried out of places most people will never hear the names of. At 68 years old, you learn that silence is usually the easier road, especially when you've spent most of your life trying to forget the things that made you capable of doing what I'd just done in that kitchen. 3 months before that night, nobody in our family would have believed it could end up this way, least of all Derek. Derek Coleman was 39, tall, expensive haircut, the kind of white teeth that only happen with a payment plan, and an opinion about absolutely everything, whether you asked for it or not. He sold luxury trucks on the edge of Wilmington and walked into every room like he expected applause just for showing up. When he married my daughter Emily, I did something I don't do easily. I tried to like him, not tolerate him, actually like him. See, my wife Carol died of breast cancer 12 years back, and after that, Emily was pretty much everything I had left standing upright in this world. So when she brought this man home, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager, I let a lot of things slide that probably should have stopped me cold. The bragging, the drinking that started a little early most nights, the way he'd talk right over her mid-sentence like her thoughts were just background noise until his own caught up. The way she'd laugh a little too fast, a little too nervous whenever he made a joke at her expense. I told myself that's just how young couples are, rough edges. Everybody's got them. Looking back now, that might have been the first mistake I made. My name is Walter Hayes. 68 years old, widower, retired. I live in a small coastal town in North Carolina, the kind of place where everybody fishes, everybody shows up to church on Sunday, whether they believe every word of the sermon or not, and everybody operates under the unspoken agreement that whatever happens behind a family's front door stays behind that door. Most folks around here know me as the quiet old man with the pickup truck and the yellow Labrador named Duke. They see me picking through tomatoes at the Saturday market. They see me fixing a neighbor's lawnmower for the price of a cold beer. They see me sitting alone at the diner every Thursday morning, black coffee, no cream, same booth. That's all they see. And for a long time, I preferred it exactly that way. I spent 26 years inside naval special warfare. By the time they finally let me retire, I had witnessed enough violence, enough funerals, enough adrenaline to last 3 or 4 ordinary lifetimes. Peace Real peace became something I guarded like it was the last thing I owned, which is a strange thing to admit because it turns out I didn't actually have as much peace as I thought I did. I just had a very good imitation of it. Carol and I built a plain, steady life together while I was still active. Deployments came and went. She raised Emily mostly on her own for long stretches, learned to fix her own car, learned to read my silences over the phone better than I ever explained them out loud. When I finally came home for good, the transition wasn't the triumphant homecoming people picture in movies. It was two people relearning how to live in the same house again, one careful week at a time. Emily was still in high school then, and by the time she graduated and moved off to college 2 hours inland, I'd only just started feeling like a normal father instead of a stranger who occasionally visited. Then Carol got sick, and everything else in our lives quietly rearranged itself around that fact. I retired not long after her diagnosis, told myself it was for her, and mostly it was. But some part of me was also relieved to have a reason to finally set the uniform down. 26 years is a long time to carry certain things, and by the end I wasn't sure how much longer my mind could keep carrying them without setting something down first. Emily met Derek about 3 years after her mother passed. She was 27, working at a marketing firm in Wilmington, still finding her footing after losing Carol. Derek showed up selling her a car she didn't need, charmed her into a test drive, and somehow talked his way into a phone number by the end of the afternoon. When she told me about him for the first time, she was laughing on the phone in a way I hadn't heard from her in over a year. That laugh alone was enough to make me want to like the man responsible for it, whoever he turned out to be. The first crack in that imitation of mine, the one I'd built up around my own peace, showed up 2 years later at Thanksgiving. Emily had always loved cooking with her mother when she was young. Sweet potato casserole, homemade rolls, the pecan pie that took Carol half a day and somehow still tasted rushed to her, though nobody else ever noticed. That particular Thanksgiving, Emily let the turkey go a little too long in the oven. Nothing dramatic, a shade dry, that's all. The kind of thing that happens in every kitchen in America at least once a year. Derek carved himself a slice, took one bite, and said, loud enough for the whole table, "Well, good thing you're pretty, Em, because you sure aren't winning any cooking shows." Everybody laughed. That uncomfortable kind of laugh people do when they're not sure if it's a joke or not. So they laugh anyway, just to be safe. Emily laughed too, but I was watching her shoulders, and they went up and stiff a half-second before the laugh even started, like her body already knew the punch was coming before her ears finished hearing it. You spend enough years in the teams, you learn to read tiny signals, a shift in someone's stance, a held breath, a flicker before the smile. Tiny reactions tell you the truth long before words do. And that tiny flinch at my own dinner table told me something I wasn't ready to look at directly yet. So I started watching more carefully after that. At Christmas, he made a comment about the sweater she'd picked out for herself. Something about how it made her look like she'd given up. At Easter, he snapped at her in front of the whole family because she'd forgotten to grab ice for the cooler, like it was some kind of moral failure. At every dinner after that, he corrected the way she told stories. "That's not how it happened. You always exaggerate everything. Emily can't keep a detail straight to save her life. Small cuts, never big enough on their own to justify a scene. Just constant, and that's the part people miss about this kind of thing. It's never the one big blow that breaks somebody. It's the 1,000 small ones nobody else in the room thinks is worth mentioning. And every single time, Emily smiled through it. That smile worried me a lot more than if she'd ever raised her voice back at him. One July evening, I had them both over for a backyard barbecue, nothing special. Burgers, corn on the cob, a store-brand potato salad I wasn't proud of, but nobody was going to complain about. A couple of neighbors wandered over too, drawn by the smoke and the smell. Derek had already been drinking before he showed up. I could smell the whiskey riding underneath his cologne the second he got out of the truck. He stood near the grill while I flipped burgers and said with a little laugh, "You know, Walt, you're the calmest old man I've ever met in my life." I smiled politely. "That's supposed to be an insult?" "Nah," he said, taking a pull off his beer. "Just saying. Every old military guy I've ever met can't shut up about it for 5 minutes. You barely bring it up." "That's because I retired," I said. The neighbors chuckled a little. Derek wasn't done, though. "I mean, seriously, what did you even do in the Navy? File paperwork somewhere?" More laughing. I just shrugged and said, "Something like that." He pointed his beer bottle at me like it made a point. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Emily acts like you're some kind of secret badass or something." Emily went stiff. "Derek, stop." He grinned wider, the way men like him do when they know they've found a nerve. "What? I'm kidding around." Then he leaned in a little, still smiling. "You know what I actually think. I think most of those old military stories get exaggerated over the years." The whole backyard got quiet for a second. I just flipped another burger, no reaction at all. And that, more than anything I could have said, seemed to frustrate him. Men like Derek feed on reactions the way a fire feeds on air. Take the air away, and something in them starts to panic. A few minutes later, Emily came inside to help me carry plates to the kitchen. The moment we were alone, out of earshot, she said quietly, "I'm sorry." I looked at her carefully. There was a faint bruise along her wrist, half hidden under a swipe of makeup that hadn't quite matched her skin tone. My stomach dropped straight to the floor. "What happened there?" I asked. She yanked her sleeve down instantly. "Nothing." "Emily," she wouldn't look at me. "Dad, please." That word, please. Not the tired kind of please a daughter uses when her father's being overprotective. This was different. This was afraid. And that's when I knew. Maybe not every detail yet, but enough. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my garage workshop with Duke, asleep beside my chair and rain tapping soft against the tin roof. I opened an old wooden storage chest I hadn't touched in years. Inside were pieces of a life I mostly kept locked away. Photographs of men who never made it home, challenge coins, a folded flag, and one laminated card I'd made back when Emily was 16 years old, emergency communication codes. Nothing extreme, I want to be clear about that. Just a handful of simple phrases we'd worked out together in case she ever felt unsafe somewhere and couldn't speak freely. We treated it almost like a game back then. I remember her rolling her eyes at 16 and telling me, "Dad, you watch way too many spy movies." Maybe I did, Or maybe fathers who've seen certain things understand the world a little differently than their daughters wish they had to. There was only one rule I made her promise never to break. If she ever sent the real code, the actual distress signal, I would come. No questions asked, no hesitation, immediately. Around midnight, my phone lit up on the arm of the chair. A text from Emily. "Dad, can you send me Mom's peach pie recipe?" Underneath it, a string of numbers. 2, 5, 6, 3, 9, 1. My blood went cold in about half a second. 3, 9, 1 meant one specific thing and nothing else. Immediate danger. Call the police. I stared at that screen for maybe 2 seconds total. Then 26 years of training woke back up inside my bones like it had never actually left. Calm, focused, cold. I stood up slowly, walked over to the gun safe, and opened it. Not because I wanted revenge, because my daughter was scared, and fear does something specific to a father that most people never fully understand until it happens to them. There's a strange thing about fear once you're older. Young men think fear is loud, pounding heart, shaking hands, ragged breathing. But the real fear, the kind that shows up when someone you love might actually be dying somewhere close by, comes in quiet, cold, efficient. That's exactly how I felt driving through these dark, wet roads toward Emily's neighborhood. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the rain. My old Ford pickup rattled every time I hit a pothole, but I barely registered it. I had 911 on speaker. The dispatcher sounded young, a little nervous. "Sir, can you describe the situation?" "Possible domestic assault in progress," I said, steady. "Female victim inside the residence, male suspect intoxicated." "Do you know if weapons are involved?" "Unknown." "Sir, are you currently approaching the house?" "Yes." "Please wait for responding officers." I watched my own headlights cutting through the rain and said quietly, "No, I won't be doing that." A pause on her end. Then, carefully, "Sir, are you armed?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "What kind of firearm?" "Locked in the vehicle. I don't intend to use it unless it becomes absolutely necessary." That part, at least, was true. People have a certain picture in their head of what a retired Navy man is eager to do in a moment like that. Most of us, and I mean most of us, spend the rest of our lives trying to avoid exactly that kind of moment ever happening again. Her voice softened just slightly. "Officers are 4 minutes out. I'll stay on with you until then." I hung up before she could argue the point further. Emily's subdivision sat right at the edge of town, next to a development that had stalled out during the pandemic and never quite recovered. Dark, half-finished houses, wet pavement, no movement anywhere except the rain. It had eased into a drizzle by the time I pulled up across from their place. Every downstairs light was blazing, and I could hear the yelling before I'd even gotten the truck door open. Derek, drunk, furious. I crossed the yard quietly. Age changes the way you move. There's no getting around that. At 68, my knees complaining cold weather, my shoulders pop if I reach too high in the garage. But the important things training gives you, the awareness, the balance, the sense of timing, those don't leave. Not the parts that matter. I got close to the front window and looked in, and every fear I'd been carrying for weeks suddenly became real in front of me. Emily was backed against the kitchen counter, crying, one side of her lip bleeding. Shattered glass covered the floor around her bare feet. Derek stood inches from her face, screaming, and then he grabbed her wrist hard enough to make her stumble sideways into the counter. Something inside me went perfectly still, and I need you to understand I wasn't angry. That surprises people whenever I tell this part. Anger is an emotional thing, hot and reactive. This was something else entirely. This was the feeling you get watching a wolf circle something that can't defend itself. I moved to the side gate that led into the backyard. The patio door wasn't shut all the way, and rain was blowing softly through the gap in the curtains. Inside, Derek was still shouting. "You think your daddy's going to come save you?" Emily tried to pull her arm back. "Please stop." He shoved her shoulder, not hard enough to knock her down, hard enough to terrify her completely. That was the moment. That was all I needed. I stepped inside without a sound. No dramatic entrance, no shouting, no threats. The old hardwood barely creaked beneath my boots. Derek didn't even notice me until Emily's eyes went wide, looking past his shoulder. "Dad," he spun around, and for one unbelievable second he actually smiled at me. "Look who's here," he slurred. "Captain America." I kept walking toward him at the same steady pace. "Step away from her," he scoffed. "Or what? Step away from my daughter?" Emily's breathing had gone shallow and panicked behind him. Derek threw his arms out wide, mocking. Oh, the old man's serious now. He pointed a finger at me. "You know what your problem is, Walt. Everybody around here treats you like some wise old veteran, but you're just another retired nobody hiding in a garage." I didn't say a word back. People expect danger to announce itself with volume. It almost never does. Derek took 2 aggressive steps toward me. Bad decision on his part. The second his right shoulder dropped forward, instinct took over completely. One motion, that's genuinely all it was. It happened fast enough that he never had a chance to understand what was happening to him. I redirected his arm, rotated in behind him, and put him face down on the kitchen floor before he could even finish the punch he thought he was about to throw. He hit the tile with a curse and his beer breath exploding out of him. What the hell? I had his wrist pinned behind his back, careful, controlled, firm enough that he couldn't move, but nowhere near enough pressure to actually break anything. "Stop resisting," I said calmly. Emily stood frozen by the counter, hands over her mouth, crying. Derek bucked upward once, trying to throw me off. I adjusted the angle slightly. He gasped instantly and went still. Pain compliance, precise, controlled, temporary, old muscle memory that never fully goes away no matter how many years pass. "You're hurting me," he yelled. "You're not hurt," I said. "You're restrained." That made him angrier than the pain had. He kept spitting curses while he struggled uselessly beneath me. Honestly, the whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds before red and blue lights started sweeping across the living room windows. 2 deputies came through the front door with their weapons drawn. I let go of one hand immediately and raised it slightly. "Victim secure. Suspect restrained." Both deputies froze for a half-second, taking in the scene. One of the younger ones kept his weapon trained on Derek. The older deputy looked at me, and I watched the recognition happen behind his eyes in real time. Not recognition of my face, recognition of behavior, calm breathing, controlled restraint. No wasted movement, military. He approached carefully. "Sir, can you stand up slowly for me?" I nodded once and eased myself off Derek. The second the pressure lifted, he rolled over and started shouting about how this psycho old man had attacked him. The deputy didn't even glance at him. He looked straight at Emily instead. "Ma'am, are you injured?" Her lip trembled. "Yes?" That one word changed the entire temperature of the room. The younger deputy cuffed Derek and started reading him his rights over the top of his furious protests. "This is insane. You can't arrest me. He attacked me first." Nobody was listening to him anymore. Emily collapsed against the kitchen counter, sobbing in a way that had clearly been building for a very long time. I grabbed the throw blanket off the nearby chair and wrapped it around her shoulders, the exact same way I used to after thunderstorms when she was a little girl. "It's okay," I whispered. "You're safe now." She grabbed onto me like she was drowning, and something in me nearly broke right there in that kitchen. Fathers always assume they'll recognize the moment their child starts suffering, but suffering doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly for years, right under your own roof, in a family you thought you understood completely. The older deputy came over once the paramedics arrived. Quiet voice, respectful. "You military? Retired Navies, huh?" I said. His eyes flicked briefly toward the way I'd taken Derek down, then back up to my face. "Well, you handled yourself professionally." That word almost made me laugh out loud. Professionally. Like this had been just another job, but it wasn't a job. It was my daughter, and for the first time in a long while I felt something painfully clear. I should have come sooner. There's a specific kind of silence that fills a house right after violence leaves it. Not peaceful silence. Heavy silence, the kind that seeps into the walls and the furniture the way smoke does after a fire finally gets put out. Emily stayed with me after the arrest. Neither of us said much those first couple of days. She slept in her old bedroom upstairs, the one still decorated with faded horse posters from when she was 13. I hadn't changed a thing in there over the years. Same quilt Carol had sewn by hand, same little ceramic lighthouse lamp on the nightstand. Maybe some part of me always hoped she'd end up back in that room someday. Just never like this. The first morning, I woke before sunrise out of old habit and made coffee while rain tapped against the windows, and Duke snored by the back door. Emily came down wearing one of my old Navy sweatshirts, her lip worse in daylight than it had looked the night before. Purple, swollen, a small cut near the corner. Seeing it in the morning light hit me harder than it had the night before somehow. She wouldn't meet my eyes while pouring her coffee. "Sorry," she whispered. I frowned. "For what?" "For all this." That single sentence told me more about how long she'd been trapped than any conversation could have. That's the thing people rarely understand about victims. They apologize for having survived. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You don't owe me an apology, sweetheart." Her eyes filled instantly. She looked away. "I should have left him a long time ago." I took a slow breath. Maybe. Her shoulders sank even further. "I should have. But fear," I said, "keeps people in bad places a lot longer than logic ever would." Neither of us said anything for a while after that. Then, quietly, she said something that cut straight through me. "I didn't want you to think I'd failed." At 68 years old, after war and funerals and every hard thing life had already thrown at me, I did not expect a single sentence from my own daughter to hurt that much. I stared at my coffee for a long moment because the truth, underneath all of it, was that some of that was on me. I hadn't been an easy father after Carol died. That's the part men of my generation don't like admitting out loud. We were raised to treat grief like a weakness you weren't allowed to show. Work through the pain, stay quiet, keep your hands busy. So that's exactly what I did after cancer took my wife. I fixed engines, cleaned gutters that didn't need cleaning, mowed the lawn twice a week whether it needed it or not. Anything that kept me from sitting still long enough to actually feel the loneliness underneath it. Emily was 24 then, young, grieving her mother, still needing a father who could show up emotionally. And instead, I quietly disappeared into myself. Not out of cruelty, just distance, and children, even fully grown ones, feel that kind of distance more sharply than we ever let ourselves believe. A few days later, Emily finally started opening up for real. We sat on the back porch, watching rain drift over the marsh behind my property, Duke chasing squirrels through the wet grass like it was the most important job in the world. Emily wrapped both hands around a mug of tea. She wasn't really drinking. "He wasn't always like this," she said softly. I stayed quiet, let her keep going. "When we first met, Derek was charming, funny. He made me feel protected. That's usually how it starts," I said. She nodded slowly. "After the wedding, little things started changing." "Like what?" "He started criticizing my friends first. Then it was my clothes. Then the way I talked in front of people. I listened without interrupting a single word. Age teaches you that sometimes people don't need you to fix anything in that moment. They just need room to finally say the true version of events out loud, maybe for the first time. If dinner wasn't ready exactly when he wanted it," Emily continued, "he'd get irritated. If I disagreed with him in front of anybody, he'd punish me for it later." "What kind of punishment?" She swallowed hard. "Silent treatment at first." Her voice shrank a little. Then yelling. I already knew what was coming next before she said it. "The first time he shoved me, he cried about it afterward, said he was under a lot of stress, said it would never happen again." I closed my eyes for a second. Classic pattern: apology, excuse, a short stretch of forced kindness, and then the whole cycle escalates again from a slightly higher starting point. Emily wiped her cheeks. I kept thinking if I just stayed calmer or got better somehow, things would go back to normal. "That's not how men like Derek work," I said. "I know that now." She looked at me carefully. "But I didn't. Not then." The pain in her voice wasn't only fear. There was embarrassment layered underneath it, and that's another piece of this that people misunderstand. Shame traps victims almost as effectively as fear does, especially women raised in families that valued appearances, especially in a generation taught that the goal was always to protect the image of a happy household, no matter what was actually happening behind the closed door. "I was ashamed," Emily whispered, "that people would think I'd chosen the wrong man." I leaned back. "Everybody chooses wrong sometimes, sweetheart." She shook her head. "Not Mom." That one landed hard because Carol had been warm in all the places I was disciplined, gentle where I was rigid. Emily had inherited her mother's softness, and I think somewhere along the way, that softness made her an easy target for a man who mistook kindness for weakness. A few days after that, Detective Sarah Bennett came by the house. Mid-40s, straightforward, the kind of person who doesn't waste your time with unnecessary small talk. She sat at my kitchen table going through paperwork while Emily nervously twisted a tissue in her lap. "We went through Derek's phone and laptop," Detective Bennett said. "There's evidence supporting a pattern of ongoing abuse." Emily looked down at the table. Then, quietly, she said, "There's more." The detective looked up. Emily reached into her purse and pulled out an old flash drive. "I started recording some of our arguments months ago," she said. "I didn't know why at the time. I just felt like I needed proof of something, in case anyone ever asked me if I was making it up." The room went completely still. Detective Bennett plugged the drive into her laptop, and the first clip only ran about 40 seconds. 40 seconds was more than enough. Derek screaming, something breaking, Emily crying in the background, and then one sentence from him that made my blood run cold. "If your father ever gets involved, I will make him regret it." The detective pulled her headphones off slowly. "Well," she said, quiet but certain, "that's going to help your case a great deal." Emily looked ashamed again. "I know recording him without him knowing was probably wrong." Detective Bennett shook her head immediately. "No, honey, surviving isn't wrong." That sentence visibly landed on Emily in a way I could see change something in her posture. Sometimes people who've survived something like this just need someone to give them permission to stop blaming themselves for how they made it through. That night, after the detective left, I went out to the garage alone and sat at my old workbench. Not really working on anything, just sitting with my hands flat on the wood. Combat memories had been surfacing more often since the arrest, and I've never quite understood why trauma works that way. You spend decades locking certain doors inside your own head, and then one shock to the system swings every single one of them open at once. I thought about young men bleeding out overseas. I thought about knocking on doors to tell mothers their sons weren't coming home. I thought about all the years I stayed emotionally at a distance, because that's how soldiers survive, by compartmentalizing whatever hurts too much to look at directly. And it occurred to me, sitting there in the dark with Duke's head resting on my boot, that maybe I'd done the exact same thing as a father, compartmentalized far more than I should have. Later that night, Emily found me still sitting out there. She stepped up beside my chair. "Can't sleep either." I shook my head. For a minute, we just listened to the rain on the garage roof. Then she asked out of nowhere, "Dad, were you scared over there, overseas?" Nobody had asked me that question in years. I gave her a small, tired smile. "All the time." She looked genuinely surprised. "But you were a SEAL." "Fear doesn't go away because of training," I told her. "What matters is what you do while you're afraid." She thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, "I was afraid every single day with Derek." I reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to live afraid anymore." And for the first time since she was a little girl, my daughter leaned her head against my shoulder and cried herself to sleep right there in the garage. I never expected to wear my dress uniform again. Not at my age, not after everything. The last time I'd put it on was at Carol's funeral, and even then I only wore the jacket because she used to say it reminded her that underneath all my quietness, there was still a man who once carried himself with some pride. After she passed, I folded that uniform into a garment bag in the attic and figured it would stay up there until I died too. Life has a strange way of reopening closets you thought were shut for good, especially when family's on the line. Derek's preliminary hearing landed in late October. Gray sky, cold drizzle, one of these damp Carolina mornings that settles straight into your joints. Emily sat next to me outside the courtroom, holding a paper cup of coffee with both hands, like it was the only warm thing left in the building. She looked healthier than she had in months, though still fragile in certain moments. Healing, I've learned, isn't a straight line. It's not dramatic. Some mornings she'd be smiling by breakfast. Other mornings she wouldn't leave the guest room until noon. Trauma comes in waves, and I'd learned that the hard way, decades before this ever happened to her. Inside the courtroom, Derek looked smaller than I remembered him. Not physically. Something else. It's remarkable how quickly confidence evaporates once consequences actually show up at the door. The expensive suits were gone. His hair looked unwashed. Dark circles sat under his eyes from weeks in county lockup. But the bitterness hadn't left him at all. The moment he spotted me sitting next to Emily, his jaw locked tight. His parents sat behind him looking exhausted and clearly embarrassed. I actually felt a flicker of sympathy for them. No parent raises a child hoping he'll grow into someone cruel. At least, I don't think most do. Derek's attorney stood up and immediately went to work, painting his client as the real victim here, which happens more often than people realize in domestic violence cases, especially when the accused comes from money. The lawyer described Derek as a stressed husband, a hard-working provider, a man struggling emotionally under pressure nobody understood. Then he turned toward me, and Mr. Walter Hayes, he said, with real theater in his voice, used excessive force while acting entirely outside the law. I didn't move. The prosecutor across the aisle looked almost bored because evidence doesn't respond to performance. The state laid it all out, Emily's injuries, police photographs, the audio recordings, medical reports, statements from neighbors who'd heard things over the months and never quite known what to do about it. And then came the body camera footage. The whole courtroom watched in silence as the deputies walked into that kitchen. There I was on the screen, calm, controlled, holding Derek down without ever striking him once. No shouting, no rage, just containment. One deputy's camera caught Derek shouting drunken threats while Emily cried against the counter with blood on her lip. After that footage played, the defense's argument basically fell apart in real time. But Derek still wasn't finished embarrassing himself. When he finally took the stand, he blamed everyone but himself. The alcohol, the stress, the state of the marriage, Emily being, in his words, too emotional. Then he looked straight at me and sneered, he brainwashed her against me. That sentence did something to Emily I hadn't expected. I felt her posture change beside me. She stood up before the prosecutor even asked her to. Her voice shook at first, then steadied fast. "No," she said. The courtroom turned toward her. "My father didn't brainwash me." She took a long breath. "He saved my life." Absolute silence followed that. Emily described years of emotional abuse in careful, painful detail. The insults, the isolation, the daily walking on eggshells routine that had become her whole life without her fully noticing when it started. A few jurors looked visibly moved. One older woman near the back wiped tears from her eyes without hiding it. Then Emily said something that hit me harder than any memory from overseas ever had. I stopped recognizing myself during that marriage. War leaves wounds on soldiers. But abuse erases people slowly, while they're still standing in front of you, still smiling at dinner parties, still saying, "I'm fine," every single time somebody asks. Watching Emily on that stand, I kept thinking about something Carol used to say back when Emily was small and afraid of thunderstorms. She'd say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's just fear that finally decided to speak up anyway. I'd never fully understood that sentence until I watched my grown daughter stand in front of a room full of strangers and describe the worst years of her life in careful, steady detail, her voice cracking here and there, but never once stopping. That's not the same woman who used to laugh nervously at Derek's jokes to keep the peace at a dinner table. Something in her had already started rebuilding itself, piece by piece, long before that day in court. During a break, the prosecutor found me near the vending machines in the hallway. "You were special warfare, weren't you?" I gave her a small nod. "How could you tell?" she asked, smiling faintly. "My brother was Marine Recon." I almost laughed. Military people find each other eventually, one way or another. She got a little more serious. "Your restraint that night probably saved your daughter's case." "What do you mean?" "If you'd lost your temper and beaten him half to death, the defense would have shifted the whole focus onto you instead of onto him." I nodded slowly because she was right. Revenge feels satisfying for exactly as long as it lasts, which is never very long. Control protects the people you love a lot longer than revenge ever does. That particular lesson took me most of a lifetime to actually understand. The final sentencing hearing came 6 weeks later. Emily almost didn't go, but in the end she decided she needed the closure more than she needed to avoid the discomfort. That morning, I climbed up into the attic and pulled the old garment bag down. The fabric still smelled faintly of cedar. As I pinned the medals back onto the chest one by one, memories I hadn't visited in years came drifting back. Friends laughing in the back of a helicopter, young men writing letters home they never got the chance to send, funerals with folded flags handed to mothers who couldn't stop shaking. I stared at my silver star for a good long minute before pinning it on. Truthfully, I never cared much for medals. Medal doesn't bring anybody back, but they matter to people who weren't there. They remind civilians that sacrifice existed long before comfort became something everybody expected as a baseline. When I walked into that courthouse in full dress whites, every conversation in the hallway stopped. Even Emily just stared at me for a second. "You never wear that," she whispered. "I know. You look different." Maybe I did, or maybe, for the first time, she was finally seeing all the parts of me I'd spent years keeping tucked away in an attic. Inside the courtroom, Derek looked genuinely stunned the moment he saw me. For the first time since I'd known him, real fear crossed his face, and it had nothing to do with any threat of violence. It was something more humiliating than that. He was realizing in real time that the quiet old man he'd mocked at a backyard barbecue had spent a lifetime carrying weight that Derek wouldn't have survived for even a single week. The judge went through the evidence carefully before asking whether I wanted to make a statement. I stood slowly. Every joint in my body reminded me that I hadn't been young in a long time, but my voice came out steady. "I spent most of my life around violence," I said. "War, death, fear, loss. And if there's one thing that time taught me, it's this." I looked toward Derek for a moment. "Strength has nothing to do with making people afraid of you." A few heads in the gallery lowered. Real strength, I continued, is protecting the people who can't protect themselves in that particular moment, especially family. Derek was staring at the floor now, no arrogance left in him at all, just shame. Then I said something that even surprised me. I don't hate Derek. Emily looked over at me, startled. I hate what he became. I hate what he did to my daughter. But hatred spreads if you keep feeding it, and it never stops spreading on its own. The judge listened closely. What I'm asking this court for, I said, is accountability, not destruction. That distinction mattered more to me than anything else I said that day. The sentence that followed included prison time, mandatory alcohol treatment, a domestic violence rehabilitation program, and a permanent restraining order. As the deputies led him out, Derek stopped near the door for a second and looked back at Emily. His eyes were full, and this time it didn't look manipulative. It looked broken. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Emily didn't answer him. She just held my hand while he disappeared through the courtroom doors, and for the first time in years, I watched the fear finally leave her eyes for good. Winter moved slowly after the trial ended. That's the thing about healing once you've reached a certain age. Nothing happens quickly anymore, not recovery, not trust, not forgiveness. Every piece of it arrives one careful, unhurried step at a time, and you learn to stop expecting it to happen faster than it's going to. By February, the cold Carolina rain had softened into something gentler, and the trees behind my property started hinting at green again. Emily slowly began rebuilding pieces of her own life. She found a small apartment downtown above a flower shop run by an elderly widow named Diane. Nothing fancy, but it was safe and it was quiet. And morning sunlight filled the little kitchen in a way that mattered more than it should have. Safety has a way of becoming beautiful once you've lived without it for a while. She also went back to working part-time at the public library. At first, she worried people around town would whisper about the trial behind her back. But small southern towns will surprise you sometimes. Most people treated her with a kind of gentleness she didn't expect, especially the older women, the ones who'd lived long enough themselves to recognize pain the moment they see it in someone else's face. One afternoon over coffee, she admitted something quietly. I thought everybody would judge me for staying as long as I did. I stirred cream into my mug slowly. Most folks over 60 have survived something painful of their own, I said. It changes how they look at other people's pain. She looked down. I still feel embarrassed sometimes. I nodded. That feeling might stick around a while. She looked a little worried hearing that, so I added, but shame fades a lot faster once it's exposed to love instead of kept hidden in secrecy. Carol used to say something close to that. Funny how a good marriage leaves pieces of a person living inside you long after they're gone. As for me, my own life shifted too. For years after retirement, I'd isolated myself more than I ever fully admitted. Routine had become my hiding place. Hardware store, fishing pier, television, sleep, repeat, day after day. But after everything with Emily, that same silence stopped feeling peaceful. It started feeling lonely instead. And there's a real difference between the two, even if it took me a long time to notice which one I'd actually been living in. So I started reconnecting with people, mostly other old veterans. A retired Marine named Curtis talked me into showing up for Wednesday morning breakfast at the VFW hall. I resisted at first, too many memories waiting in that room. But eventually, I went. And it turns out old soldiers laugh a lot more than most civilians expect. We talked about grandkids, bad knees, blood pressure medication, and boats that refused to start on the first try. Very little about combat, which surprises younger folks when I mention it. Truth is, most veterans don't spend their later years reliving the war. Mostly, we spend it appreciating just how good ordinary peace actually feels. One morning after breakfast, Curtis looked over at me and said, "You seem lighter lately." I thought about that the whole drive home. Maybe he was right. Not happy, exactly, not yet, but lighter. Like some old weight had finally shifted its position after sitting in the same place for years. I even started talking, a little, about things I'd never spoken about with anyone outside the service. Not the missions themselves, most of that stays where it belongs, but the weight of them. Curtis had lost a nephew to suicide 2 years after he came home from his second tour, and one Wednesday morning over eggs and burnt coffee. He told me about the guilt that still visited him some nights, the feeling that he should have noticed something, should have called more, should have asked harder questions when the boy said he was fine. I told him about the men whose names I still say out loud sometimes when the house gets too quiet, just so somebody besides me still remembers them existed. Neither one of us fixed anything that morning. That's not really how it works at our age. But something about saying those things out loud to another man who understood, without needing an explanation, made the weight easier to carry going forward. I started showing up most Wednesdays after that, and some weeks I even looked forward to it, which surprised me more than it probably should have. Come springtime, Emily brought my grandson Noah over for Sunday dinner. He was 10 years old, skinny, curious, missing one front tooth he was extremely proud of showing off. Before the divorce, Derek had barely allowed Noah to visit me alone, said something once about me being too old-fashioned. Now the boy ran through my backyard like he owned every square foot of it. Children heal faster than adults do, provided you give them safety early enough in the process. That afternoon, we sat by the lake behind my property, fishing for bluegill while dragonflies skimmed across the water. Noah studied me for a while before finally asking, "Mom says you were in the Navy." I was. "Like regular Navy?" I smiled. "Something like that." He grinned. "Mom said you tackled Dad like Batman." I nearly choked laughing. "Your mother exaggerates." "No, she doesn't." "Yes, she does." "Nope." I shook my head, still smiling, and then Noah went quiet for a minute. Finally, he asked, softer this time, "Why was Dad so mean?" And there it was, the question every child in this kind of situation eventually asks somebody. I looked out over the water before answering. Sometimes people carry anger they never learned how to control. Did he hate Mom? No, I said honestly. That's actually what makes it sad. Noah frowned, thinking that over. Then why hurt her? I thought about all the years I'd spent studying different forms of violence, in war, in fear, in the ways people try to control each other. Then I gave him the simplest answer I had. Because some people confuse love with ownership. He considered that seriously, the way kids sometimes do when they understand more than we give them credit for. A few minutes later, I handed him the fishing rod. You know what real strength actually is? What? making the people around you feel safe. He grinned proudly 15 minutes later after landing a tiny bluegill that put up way more fight than its size suggested. At 10 years old, that boy already handled disappointment better than plenty of grown men I've known. One evening in early summer, Emily showed up at my door holding an envelope, no return address. "I know who it's from," she said quietly. I recognized the prison stamp immediately. Derek. She sat beside me at the kitchen table while I opened it carefully. The handwriting was messy, but honest. No excuses in it, no self-pity dripping through every line the way I half expected. Just a kind of plain, unflinching honesty. He admitted things I hadn't expected him to admit at all. The drinking, the insecurity underneath all of it, the need to control everything around him, the shame that came after. One sentence stood out from the rest. I spent years trying to feel powerful by making other people feel smaller. That line told me his rehabilitation might actually be starting to work, or at least beginning to take root somewhere underneath all that old bitterness. Emily looked nervous while I finished reading. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. I folded the letter carefully. "I think remorse is painful when it's real. Do you forgive him?" That question sat heavy in the air between us for a while. At my age, I've learned forgiveness isn't a switch you flip once. It's a decision you end up practicing over and over, sometimes daily, sometimes only every few weeks when the memory resurfaces. "I don't know yet," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "That's fair." Then, after a long silence, she said something that nearly brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you for saving me." I looked at my daughter, healthier now, stronger, still healing in the places that take the longest, and I realized something important sitting there in that kitchen. I hadn't saved her by myself. She'd saved herself the moment she found the courage to ask for help in the first place. A lot of people never manage that. It takes its own kind of courage, one that doesn't get nearly enough credit. A few Sundays later, our family gathered around my table again. Nothing fancy that time either. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread, the exact kind of meal Carol used to make back when money was tight, but love never was. Sunlight came through the kitchen windows, while Noah laughed at something playing on the television in the next room. Emily looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. Real peace, not the forced kind, not survival mode dressed up as calm, actual peace. Sitting there listening to the sound of dishes clinking and family voices filling the house again, I finally understood something that took me the better part of 7 decades to figure out. When I was young, I thought strength meant winning fights. War taught me strength meant simply surviving pain. But getting older taught me the real truth underneath both of those ideas. Strength is answering the phone when someone you love is afraid. Strength is staying calm when giving in to anger would feel a whole lot easier in the moment. Strength is protecting the people who need protecting without losing your own humanity somewhere in the process, and sometimes strength is finally allowing yourself to heal too, instead of just standing guard over everybody else forever. If this story landed with you tonight, if you've ever loved someone through a hard season, protected your own family when it counted, or learned a hard lesson later in life than you would have liked, share it with someone who might need to hear it right now. And remember, no matter how old you are or how much time you think you've already lost, It is never too late to choose kindness over control, peace over pride, and love over fear.